Thank you. Welcome to the workshop. I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items before turning it over to Gary Epstein, the chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force, for some welcoming remarks. If you have a question during the workshop, please write it down on the form contained in your handout. We'll collect those before the break, and we also have extra copies at the registration table. If you're watching online, please email your questions to auction1001@fcc.gov. Please include your name and your organization in addition to the question. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, depending on the time constraints and how many questions we get. Also, if you're watching live, we encourage you to download the slides. They're available at www.fcc.gov/auctions/1001 on the Education tab. It will be easier for you to view the presentation material if you have the slides. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Epstein, Chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Incentive Auction Bidder Education Workshop. Starting last September, whenever I've had the occasion to address a group like this, I've opened by announcing the number of days until the auction begins. So, in keeping with tradition, there are 113 days until the start of the auction on March 29th, 2016. So here's an equally important number, 2. In about 2 hours, the window for the filing reverse auction applications will open. It's a moment that's seen far beyond the horizon when we began the rulemaking proceeding on this auction back in 2012. That's 1,167 days ago, if you're counting. But the moment is here, and it's real. So it's more than fitting that we're here today to walk through Form 177, the form a broadcaster will use to apply to participate in the reverse auction. We've already released the instructions and an interactive tutorial on Form 177, but over the next few hours, you'll get the chance to hear details directly from the auction team and ask us questions. We'll explain each section of the form, discuss dates and deadlines, identify the information required and how to enter it into the form, and show you how to submit your completed application. We'll also review the channel sharing portions of the form and explain the so-called red light rule and how it applies to this unique auction. Finally, we'll review the bidding relinquishment options, how to indicate them on a form, and the relationship between selecting options in your application and committing to a preferred option on March 29th. Once you leave here today, you're on the clock. The window will be open, and eligible stations will have until 6 p.m. Eastern Time on January 12th to submit applications. We will remain available to answer your questions throughout this process. Finally, let me thank today's presenters in advance: Craig Bomberger, Katie Hinton, Mary Margaret Jackson, and Duran Bumpkin. And, of course, our indefatigable and indomitable Vice Chair, Howard Simons, who will run the question and answer section of the presentation. With that, I'll turn the podium over to Craig, who's the Deputy Chief of the Auction and Spectrum Access Division of the Wireless Bureau. Craig will start us off with a closer look at the pre-auction process and the path to the reverse auction.
Thank you, Gary. So before I start, I'm required to read a disclaimer to you. We're here to present some useful information today, but it's not the official source of the information. Nothing herein is intended to supersede any provisions of the Commission's rules or public notices. These slides should not be used as a substitute for a prospective applicant's review of the Commission's relevant orders, rules, and public notices. Prospective applicants must familiarize themselves thoroughly and remain current with the Commission's rules relating to the incentive auction, the application and auction procedures, and the procedures, terms, and conditions contained in the public notices. All right, now we're going to review some important dates. As Gary said, the FCC Form 177 filing window opens today at noon Eastern Time. Then the first important deadline is January 12, 2016, when the FCC Form 177 filing window closes before 6 p.m. Eastern Time. This means that your applications must be in by 6 o'clock before then. Next, the bidding and post-auction process tutorial will be available by the end of February 2016. Then comes the second important deadline. Initial commitments are due prior to 6 p.m. on March 29, 2016. These two deadlines, the FCC Form 175 filing window closing and the initial commitment deadline, are crucial to your participation in the reverse auction. To avoid any last-minute obstacles, please file early. We can't stress this enough. In the past, we've had calls from applicants who tried to fill out their form online for other auctions close to the deadline. And if you don't get the form in on time, then you won't be able to participate in the auction. We also encourage you to try to log in and begin your form soon, and preferably well before Christmas. Then approximately 3 to 4 weeks after the initial commitment deadline, the initial clearing target and band plan will be announced. Then the specific date for the mock auction and date when bidding begins in the clock rounds of the reverse auction will be provided in the final confidential status letter that will be sent to each applicant qualified to bid. We've provided 3 tools to help you complete the Form 177 and meet the first deadline. These tools are today's workshop, an interactive online tutorial, and the FCC Form 177 Application Instructions Public Notice. These items, along with other information, are available on the Commission's Auction 1001 webpage at fcc.gov/auctions/1001. When you navigate to the Education tab on that website, you'll find a link for the interactive online tutorial, which requires Flash Player. The slides for the workshop are also available on the Education tab, and a video of this workshop will be posted here as well. For the FCC Form 177 Applications Instruction Public Notice, click on the Public Notices tab and look for the link titled Instructions for Completing Reverse Auction Application, FCC Form 177. Again, this information is on the slides, which are available for download from the website. This concludes my part of the agenda. I will now turn it over to Aaron Griffith, an attorney in the Auctions and Spectrum Access Division, who will provide more information about the application process and the form itself.
Thank you, Craig. All right. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the path that you're going to be on for the next few months if you apply to participate in the reverse auction. As Craig mentioned, the first step on this path is filing the application to participate, which is known as the FCC Form 177. If you do not file this application to participate prior to the deadline on January 12th, you will not be able to participate in the auction. Once the filing window closes, the Commission staff will review your application to determine whether or not you have provided all of the information required by the rules. We will send out a first confidential status letter, which will notify you about the status of your application, whether it is complete or incomplete. Once, if the staff has determined that the application is not complete, there will be a window of time for you to be able to correct minor defects and make minor amendments to the application. This period of time is the resubmission period. When the resubmission filing window closes, the staff again will review the applications. Following that review, it will send a second confidential status letter, again notifying you of the status of the application. Continuing on that path, an applicant whose application was complete in the second status letter will need to make an initial commitment to a preferred relinquishment option for each complete station in its application that it would like to be able to bid for in the clock rounds of the reverse auction. As Craig mentioned, the deadline to make that initial commitment is March 29th, 2016. Applicants whose applications in the second status letter were deemed incomplete will not be able to make initial commitments. Once the initial commitment deadline passes, the auction system will use that information to help determine an initial spectrum clearing target and an associated band plan, which will be the amount of spectrum that the Commission will be trying to clear during the first stage of the incentive auction. Once that clearing target has been determined, we will send out a final confidential status letter to each applicant whose application was complete in the second status letter. This final letter will let such applicants know whether or not their stations are qualified to bid in the clock rounds of the reverse auction. A station could be deemed not qualified if an applicant did not make an initial commitment, if the initial commitment made by the applicant could not be accommodated by the auction system, or if the auction system determined that that particular station is not needed. Such stations would be subject to repacking in their pre-auction bands. All stations that were found to be qualified to bid in the clock rounds of the reverse auction, and the applicants that hold those stations, will have an opportunity to participate in a mock auction prior to actually bidding in the clock rounds. Before I dive into the application form itself, it is worth pausing to note that the electronic FCC Form 177 collects several types of information, which break apart broadly into applicant information, station information, applicant ownership information, and certifications. Therefore, for an applicant to have a station become qualified to bid in the reverse auction, it must provide both complete applicant information as well as complete station information for each station it selects on its form. I am going to move now to the applicant information that the FCC Form 177 will collect, starting with the legal classification. I am not going to show you how to log into the FCC Form 177 this morning. If you need assistance with that, please reference the online tutorial and instructions that Craig mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, or call the numbers provided in those documents. So for today's purposes, we are going to walk through the form, focusing primarily on places where we think applicants may have questions. As you fill out the form, there are help links and common questions throughout designed to assist you. There is a navigation pane that appears throughout the application. The blue arrow will let you know which section of the form you are currently editing and will allow you to skip to different parts of the form. However, in some places, you will not be able to move to a different part of the form until you have filled in the required information. For example, the very first thing you are asked to fill in is the applicant's legal classification. When we say the applicant, we mean the licensee that may relinquish its spectrum usage rights in the auction. You cannot continue until you select a legal classification. On the screen, you'll see a list of different types to choose from. If your entity type is not listed, you should select Other and enter the type. Once you select the legal class, and here I've selected an LLC, you will move on to the applicant details. The name and address screen collects basic contact information about the applicant. The data entry fields that appear on the screen will depend on which legal classification you selected on the legal classification screen. For instance, I selected an LLC, so this will collect the name of the entity and its jurisdiction of formation. However, if I had selected individual for my legal classification instead, the form would require me to fill in a first and last name. The name that you put in this section should be the licensee's name, and it will be the name that is used to identify the applicant throughout the auction process. The address that you provide on the screen should be the address where the applicant is physically located. No P.O. boxes. The next screen that we're going to go over is the responsible party screen. One thing that you should understand about the electronic FCC Form 177 is that depending on what your response is to certain questions, you may or may not see some of the screens that we are going to go over today. The first example of this is the responsible party screen. The screen will either appear or not appear in your application, depending on which legal classification you chose. Under the Commission's rules, the person who may be a responsible party for an applicant depends on the nature of the applicant. For example, a corporation must identify a director or officer as its responsible party. For trusts, the responsible party should be a trustee. Applicants who are individuals are not required to provide a responsible party, thus they would not see this screen. The next screen will collect contact information. You must provide contact information for the applicant. The FCC will direct all communications regarding registration information and the application and all communications about the auction to the applicant's contact individual. You can update the contact information in the FCC Form 177 as necessary, and you should keep this contact information up to date throughout the process. As part of the contact information, you'll see that the form requires you to fill in a fax number. Why a fax number, you ask? We may use a fax number for a variety of purposes, including faxing confirmation information to you in the event that the application utilizes telephonic bidding in the auction. However, if you don't have a fax number, you can still participate. Please just fill in your phone number. We get that question a lot during application periods. Additionally, the screen requires you to fill out a contact address. And I'm sure by now you're wondering, what is our aversion to P.O. boxes? Well, you need to provide a street address so that we can send express delivery parcels to the contact person. So again, no P.O. boxes allowed. And one of the most important things about the information on this screen is that the Commission staff will communicate only with the applicant's contact person, so the contact you put on this screen, and the certifying official, who is the person that certifies the application at the very end, which we'll talk about later. The only way that the Commission staff will talk to someone other than the contact individual or certifying official is if the contact individual or the certifying official notify the Commission in writing that the applicant's counsel or other representative is authorized to speak on its behalf. Those authorizations may be sent by email to auction1001@fcc.gov. Next, we're going to go over authorized bidders. On this screen, you will designate your authorized bidders, the people that are authorized to place bids in the auction on your behalf. You are allowed to have up to 3 authorized bidders and can change them as necessary. Please plan for the unexpected to happen, and if possible, have more than 1 authorized bidder. You can bid electronically or telephonically in the auction, and the screen asks you to pick the one that you are most likely to do most of the time. This question is primarily for FCC staffing purposes, so we know how many people to staff for telephonic bidding. This concludes our tour of the applicant information screens in the FCC Form 177. We are now going to look at the station selection screens. The station selection screen will list the eligible full power and Class A stations associated with your FRN. In order to add a station to your application, you should click the Select button next to that station. Once you select the station, you will be taken through several station-specific screens where you will fill out information about that particular station. Now, this is very important. You should select each station that you may, in some universe, wish to bid on in the reverse auction. If you do not select a particular station on your auction application prior to the 6 p.m. deadline on January 12th, you will not be permitted to bid for that station in the auction. You cannot change your mind later and add a station at a later date. Once you've selected the station, the next screen you will see is the station information screen. This is an example of what the form will look like if you have selected a full power station. Note that some of the station information is pre-filled on the screen. For full power stations, you will also need to indicate whether the station is a non-commercial educational station, and if so, whether it operates on a reserved or a non-reserved channel. On this screen, you'll see an example of the station information screen for a Class A station. For both Class A stations and full power stations, below that pre-filled information that we saw are boxes where you must indicate whether the license for the selected station is subject to a non-final revocation order, has expired or been canceled and is subject to a non-final license cancellation order, or for a Class A station, whether the station is subject to a non-final downgrade order. The Commission determined that eligible broadcast licensees of facilities subject to non-final license validity proceeding or downgrade orders may participate in the reverse auction, subject to any incentive payment being held until the pending proceedings are finally resolved. If an applicant indicates that the station is subject to any of these proceedings, the applicant will need to certify in its application that it agrees with the Commission's announced procedures to withhold any incentive payment for the station pending the final outcome of the proceeding. Checking these boxes will cause the required certification to appear on a later screen in the form where you will certify to those certifications that are required for this particular station. The next piece of information that you will supply for a station is selecting the relinquishment options that you may wish to bid on for the station in the reverse auction. You may select as many options as are available to the station. I want to stress that you are not, I repeat, you are not obligated to bid on the relinquishment options that you select on this screen. However, if you do not select a particular option for this station prior to the deadline on January 12th, that option will never be available for you to bid on during the auction for this station, either as your initial commitment or in the clock bidding rounds. The term initial commitment has been mentioned a few times during this presentation, so I want to take a moment to just remind you that the initial commitment is the first bid in the auction. It is an irrevocable offer by the applicant to relinquish the relevant spectrum usage rights at the opening price offer for that bid option for that station. The deadline to make that commitment is not until March 29th, 2016. The reverse auction application is simply collecting information about which relinquishment options you wish to have the ability to bid on in the future. The options available for a station will depend on whether the station is a UHF station, high VHF station, or low VHF station. UHF stations will see options to go off air, move to high VHF, and move to low VHF. High VHF stations will have the option to go off air or move to low VHF, and low VHF stations will have the option to go off air. Bidders that bid to go off air may either relinquish their spectrum usage rights to exit broadcasting, or they may relinquish their spectrum usage rights and share a channel with another station post-auction. Now, because this is a very important topic and you cannot change your mind at a later date, I'm going to give you a brief spotlight on relinquishment options just to make sure that everyone understands the consequences of selecting or not selecting the options on the form. So as an example, if the applicant selects only the go off air relinquishment option on its auction application for a UHF station, then the go off air option is the only bid option available to that applicant for that station. It will never be able to move to low VHF or move to high VHF, either as an initial commitment or during the clock phase of the auction. For a second example, if the applicant selects only move to high VHF on its auction application for a UHF station, then moving to high VHF is the only bid option available to that applicant for that station. It will not be able to commit to go off air as a fallback option when it makes an initial commitment to a preferred relinquishment option for that station. And in case the discussion about the bidding here is making you feel a little overwhelmed, please remember that we will be conducting more outreach about the bidding process over the next several months. The first step is just filling out the application by the deadline. Another key concept that I want to highlight for you is that you are not required to bid for the options you select on the form. For example, if an applicant for a UHF station selects all of its available relinquishment options, go off air, move to high VHF, move to low VHF, that applicant can later decide that it does not wish to relinquish its spectrum usage rights at the opening price for any of those options. The applicant simply need to not make an initial commitment for that station. And like non-participating stations, that station will be subject to repacking in its pre-auction band and will not participate in the auction. And finally, I want to remind you that the Commission adopted a one-way bidding hierarchy for the relinquishment options. Therefore, if you are planning to bid for multiple options during the auction, you cannot go backwards in the hierarchy. This means, for instance, that if you begin bidding in the clock rounds of the auction, moving to a low VHF channel, you will never be able to bid to go off air. Likewise, if you do not select a particular option for the station on the FCC Form 177, that option will not be available to you in the hierarchy. So if an applicant here didn't select low VHF, this option again would basically disappear from its hierarchy. Moving back into the form, we are still on the relinquishment options page, but now we're going to talk specifically about the go off air option. If an applicant selects go off air, it must also indicate whether the applicant itself will continue to control another broadcast station after the auction if it wins all of its go off air bids. Your response to this question will trigger the FCC Form 177 to provide the applicant with certain required certifications that it will need to make for the station selected. An applicant, meaning the licensee, not a parent, must accept responsibility for any liabilities to the Commission with respect to its licenses and submit to the Commission's jurisdiction, whether or not it relinquishes the licenses and whether or not it remains a licensee. Now I will turn the presentation over to Mary Margaret Jackson of the Incentive Auction Task Force, who will walk you through how applicants will implement their channel sharing option on the FCC Form 177.
Thanks, Erin. I'm going to review today how the steps that are required to submit an application to channel share in the reverse auction. First, let's do a little background on the terminology and just to get our bearings. A sharee is a licensee that's relinquishing its spectrum usage rights on its current channel, and the sharer or a host is the licensee to which the sharee will move after the auction. Only an applicant that has selected go off air as its relinquishment option can place a bid to relinquish its full 6 megahertz of spectrum usage rights to channel share. So as this screen indicates, there are basically two ways to participate in the auction as a channel sharer. Either you indicate that you have an executed CSA, a channel sharing agreement, and or you have a present intent to channel share after the auction. For each selected station, the applicant will be asked whether the station has entered into one or more CSAs as a sharee, or whether it has the intent to channel share after the auction using these radio buttons on the screen. An intent to enter into an agreement after the auction preserves a station's ability to do so, even absent an executed agreement by January 12th. It also can enable a party that's to an executed agreement that is for some reason not implemented to enter into a new agreement after the auction. The only thing that a station has to do to preserve that ability is to check the button on this screen. Everything else I'm going to review today with respect to channel sharing has to do with stations that will have executed agreements by the January 12th application deadline. Looking at the bottom half of the screen now, if a station has selected that it has an executed channel sharing agreement, it will be asked to input the name and facility ID for all of the potential partners for any executed CSA, including backup CSAs. The call sign and channel number will autofill. A question undoubtedly will come up if you are a host that is also participating in the auction, either as a VHF station or in some other capacity. Do you have to enter in information about an executed channel sharing agreement? And the answer is no. The form is only collecting channel sharing information from the sharee's point of view, since they're the ones that are actually participating to relinquish their spectrum. After identifying all potential channel sharing partners to any executed CSA, you'll see this channel sharing attachment screen. For each executed CSA, the applicant must upload two things: an unredacted copy of the CSA and certifications by all potential host stations. A note about uploading CSA agreements. Unless required by law, the Commission will keep executed CSAs that are submitted with this form from being made public, even if the applicant that submits the CSA becomes a winning bidder. If you do become a winning bidder, you'll have to submit the CSA with your construction permit application, which will be publicly available and must be placed in the public inspection file. However, we'll allow you to redact confidential or proprietary terms in that version of the CSA that you file with your construction permit application. So long as the CSA is executed, binding on the parties, and contains all the provisions required by the Commission's rules of channel sharing agreements, you don't have to file any related or ancillary agreements. Looking specifically at commonly held stations and channel sharing arrangements, applicants that intend to channel share with a host station with which it's commonly owned or controlled may upload a statement that the stations are commonly held in lieu of actually uploading an executed CSA. You'll have to upload, as this arrow shows on the channel sharing attachment screen, you'll have to upload it as a channel sharing agreement. That is something that the form requires there to be an attachment for in order to successfully file the application. So you'll otherwise get an error there if there's no filing that is uploaded. After you've uploaded the CSA, you'll also be, the second required attachment is the channel sharer certification. We provided templates to the required channel sharer certifications in the instructions public notice, attachment 2 for full power hosts and attachment 3 for Class A hosts. So the sharer in this instance is the one that has to sign and provide the completed certification to the sharee for upload. The sharee must then upload the host certifications for all potential hosts in every executed CSA. If the stations are commonly held, again, the host still has to sign the certifications and the sharee still has to upload them. That requirement isn't different for commonly held stations. Those are the nuts and bolts of actually filing an application to channel share. I think it's worthwhile now to review the channel sharing exception to the prohibited communications rule. Applicants that file their executed CSA with their application may communicate with their channel sharing partners regarding bids and bidding strategies for the specific stations that are subject to the agreement during the quiet period, which starts at 6 p.m. on January 12th and ends at the end of the incentive auction. Stations that have not executed an agreement prior to the start of the auction, or prior to the start of the quiet period, may not continue to communicate regarding bids and bidding strategies after the filing deadline. Applicants that have a present intent to channel share after the auction, but who do not submit an executed CSA prior to the deadline, do not qualify for the exception. And finally, if there are parties to an executed CSA who do not intend to take advantage of the exception, they may indicate so if they choose on the form itself. And I will turn this back over to Erin, who will continue with the station selection part of the form.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. All right, so at this point, we have almost reached the end of the station information section. After you have completed each station selection screen that we just went over, if applicable in the case of some of the channel sharing screens, you will see an error summary for the selected station. The screen displays a summary of any errors that need to be addressed for this selected station. You see here we have an error. All errors must be completed. The station must be error-free in order for you to complete the certifications that are required for the selected station. So now we're going to take a look at what those certification screens look like once the station is error-free. Mary Margaret just went over channel sharing information with you. So if you selected yes, that you have entered into one or more executed channel sharing agreements as a sharee, then you will see this certification page, and you will need to make the certifications required by the Commission's rules in order to submit the station on your auction application. If the, and the applicant will electronically sign this screen. If you answered no to that question, then you will not see the screen because these certifications do not apply to you. The Commission's rules require several station-specific certifications that you could see. This screenshot is merely an example. The actual certifications that will appear on your application will vary based on your answers to the questions in the application. Certifications must be certified to by a person with the authority to bind the applicant, and the applicant may be required to make different certifications for different stations. Again, they have different information. Once you have completed the station certifications, the form will return you to the station selection screen. To edit any station information, you will click on the Open button next to that station. In order to be able to submit your application, you will need to either complete all of the required information and certifications for each of your selected stations, or you will need to remove the station from the application. Remember, you cannot change your mind and add stations after the initial filing deadline on January 12th. Once you have finished your station selections, you will be asked to provide ownership information. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Duran Bunkin of the Incentive Auction Task Force to discuss ownership information with you.
Thanks, Erin. As Erin said, I'm going to discuss with you the ownership section of the Form 177. What you're seeing on this slide is the first screen in the ownership section. To add the information for a disclosable interest holder, known in shorthand as DIH, you click the Add button, which will open a series of screens where you can provide information for that particular DIH. For purposes of the Form 177, as laid out in sections 12112A1 through 6 and 12204C1 of the Commission's rules, a DIH includes real parties in interest and any individual or entity that directly or indirectly controls and or holds certain ownership interests. This includes, but is not limited to, any party holding 10% or more of the stock in the applicant. In the case of a limited partnership, each limited partner whose interest in the applicant is 10% or greater. In the case of a general partnership, each partner. In the case of an LLC, each member whose interest in the applicant is 10% or greater. In the case of a non-commercial educational station, each member of the governing board and any educational institution or governmental entity with a controlling interest in the applicant. All parties holding indirect ownership interests in the applicant that equal 10% or more must also be reported, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a slide down the road. Form 177 disclosure requirements, which are made pursuant to the auction rules in the sections of Part 1 mentioned in the previous slide, differ from those in the broadcast ownership reports that commercial licensees, most of you, just filed, as well as those made in licensing, assignment, and transfer applications, all of which are made pursuant to the broadcast rules in Part 73. Noting some of the specific differences between the broadcast rules of Part 73 and Part 1 disclosure rules governing disclosure in the Form 177, I'm going to run through a list just to make some of these differences clear. Parties holding 10% or more of the voting or non-voting stock in the applicant must be reported. Passive investors, even if they have an interest less than 20%, if they otherwise meet the disclosure threshold. Individuals or entities with otherwise disclosable interests, even where a single majority shareholder exists. So for an example, if an entity owns 67% of the stock of the licensee, and another holds 33%, you must report both. Parties insulated from attribution under the broadcast ownership rules if they otherwise meet the disclosure requirement threshold. Provisions of a DIH's FRN is not required. That field can be left blank. Please note, the FCC does not intend to ever release the ownership data provided in the Form 177, absent any legal requirement to the contrary. For DIH information, the applicant should only check boxes and fill in fields to make disclosures required by the rules mentioned a few slides earlier. This means that an applicant need not disclose officers, directors, key management personnel, or management contracts simply because these options appear under disclosable interest holder type in the screen you're being shown. Instead, the applicant should check these boxes if the DIH has an interest in the applicant that requires disclosure under the rules. For example, an officer who controls the applicant or who has a 10% or greater interest in the applicant would report both of these interests. Please note that Section 12204C requires that the application identify a single officer or director. This requirement is met by providing that information in the responsible party fields of the applicant information section. At the bottom of the list of DIH types, you'll see the category Other. This enables the applicant to disclose required interests not otherwise reflected in the Form 177. When Other is checked, a brief description can be provided in the available text box. For example, a governing board member of an NCE station that must be disclosed pursuant to 12204C may be reported as Other and identified as a board member in the text box. Similarly, a trustee that has a disclosable interest in the applicant may be reported as Other and identified in the text box. The holder of a beneficial interest in a trust that amounts to a present ownership interest of 10% or more must be disclosed. Applicants can explain in an attachment, and I'll talk about that in a little while, any particular details regarding any type of ownership that are not apparent on the face of the Form 177. This screen contains the disclosable interest holder type continued categories. Again, in completing this information, the applicant should only make disclosures required by the rules cited a few slides ago. For example, it should disclose options to acquire equity and warrants only where the DIH has a present intent in the applicant that requires disclosure under the rules. On this screen, you are asked to indicate the percent of interest held by the DIH in the applicant. The reported percentage of interest held by the DIH in the applicant should reflect ownership, which is typically the equity interest held, not the percentage voting interest. DIHs that control the applicant or have other forms of ownership also must be disclosed if the DIH's ownership meets one of the thresholds specified in the rules. DIHs with no equity or other relevant ownership interest in the applicant, for example, an NCE board member, should put 0 in the percent of interest field. Information provided in the percent of interest field for each DIH should reflect its aggregate disclosable ownership interest in the applicant, both direct and indirect. So on to indirect disclosable interest holders. To determine whether you need to report an individual or entity as an indirect DIH, you will use a multiplier very similar to the one used in broadcast ownership rules. For anyone keeping track, it's 73, 35, 55, note 2. Specifically, you will successively multiply the ownership percentages for each link in the vertical chain that equals 10%, or more of the applicant. If the ownership percentage for an interest in the chain exceeds 50% or represents de facto control, then treat that link and report it as if it were a 100% interest. For this reason, in some cases, the sum of all the percentages held by DAHs may exceed 100%. If you add an indirect ownership interest, you must submit an indirect ownership attachment. The attachment may include an additional, you must submit an indirect ownership attachment. Erin will discuss warnings and errors in a few minutes, but you will receive an error when you try to submit your application that will prevent you from submitting the application if you do not upload an attachment when you have an indirect ownership interest. The attachment may include any additional information you believe will assist Commission staff in reviewing the ownership information. For example, if the disclosed equity interest in a corporate applicant does not equal 100% because numerous shareholders have interest below the 10% threshold, you can explain this in the attachment. It can also include an ownership chart, which is helpful so that the Commission staff can get a better understanding of how each DIH fits in the applicant's ownership structure. However, you are not required to provide additional information in the indirect ownership attachment. If you choose not to provide additional information, you should upload an indirect ownership attachment to the application that states not applicable. Remember, such an attachment should reflect the FCC Form 177 disclosure requirements based on the auction rules noted earlier. Consequently, the information in the attachment may differ from any Form 323 attachments depicting ownership, which are based on the broadcast rules. As you can see here, when you get to this page, the circle shows where you will click to click an additional attachment. You will then have a drop-down box in which you will be asked to select type. The type you should select is indirect. As you can see, if you do not submit this attachment and you've indicated that there's an indirect disclosable information interest holder, you will get this error message. FCC Regulated Businesses. The form asks each DIH to complete information about any other FCC regulated business in which the DIH has an interest. Completion of fields related to FRBs is not required, and they may be left blank. Now I'd like to turn the presentation back to Erin Griffith to discuss the remainder of the Form 177.
Thank you, Duran. All right, everyone, we're getting close to the end. So we've made it through our applicant information, we've made it through our station selections, we've made it through our ownership information, and we are finally at the summary, the application level error summary. Now, you've heard me mention a few times already, you'll see errors, throughout the application. I here want to clarify for you the difference between a warning and an error. You cannot submit this application, or you cannot submit your application if there are errors in it. You may submit your application if there are warnings, which would be indicated on this screen in yellow. For example, on this screen, the applicant failed to provide a zip code and its applicant information, and one of its stations is not certified. The applicant will not be able to click that Continue to Certify button at the bottom of the screen until those errors are corrected. The summary very helpfully will provide you with links to the part of the application where the error occurs, so that is a handy feature of the form. Now, this applicant has also not provided any disclosable interest holder information. As you can see, the warning there in yellow. The rules require an applicant to identify the disclosable interest holders, as Duran just described. However, the form does not know your ownership structure, and therefore it cannot tell you if you have disclosed all such required interests. That is why the lack of disclosable interest holder information is a warning and not an error. Once you have reviewed your application and fixed any errors, you may click the Continue to Certify button. However, just because the FCC Form 177 did not find any errors does not mean that your application is complete. It means that you have filled in all of the required data fields. The Commission staff will review your application for completeness under the Commission's rule. And then again, back to the very beginning of the presentation, we'll send you letters and we go through that whole process. Now, before I finish going over the form and how an applicant will actually make certifications required by the Commission's rules, I would like to discuss very briefly the Commission's red light rule in the context of the reverse auction, as the red light rule relates to several certifications that applicants are required to make on the FCC Form 177. Now, typically, under the red light rule, the Commission will not process applications or other requests for benefits by parties that owe non-tax debt to the Commission. In order to encourage broadcaster participation in the reverse auction, we waived the red light rule to permit any eligible broadcast licensee that is red lighted for debt owed to the Commission at the time it submits its FCC Form 177 to participate in the reverse auction. However, each reverse auction applicant must make several certifications concerning any debt owed by the applicant to the Commission. We advise applicants to determine whether they owe debt to the Commission and to do so periodically during the incentive auction. And we encourage applicants also to resolve all outstanding debts to the Commission as soon as possible in order to avoid the accrual of interest, penalties, and costs on unpaid debt. Additionally, it is worth noting here, while we're on the subject of debt, that winning bidders in the auction and third parties to which winning bidders instruct that payments be dispersed will be required to acknowledge and agree that the payments are subject to offset pursuant to the applicable law for debts owed to the Commission or to the United States by either the winning bidder or the third party payee designated by the winning bidder. And if you need more information about that, you can see a public notice that was released on November 25th, 2015. The Wireless Bureau clarifies procedure for dispersing reverse auction incentive payments, DA 151365. Now, on to the actual certifications. We're finally at the most exciting part of the presentation, getting to submit the application. After you click this Continue to Certify button on that error summary screen, you will be taken to the certification page, which has a list of the certifications that the applicant is required to certify to on its FCC Form 177. Remember, by this point, you have already provided certifications that are specific to any station that you selected on your application. If you do not see and click on the green Certify and Submit button at the bottom of the Certify and Submit page, you have not submitted your application. Also, please note that there is a lovely status at the top right corner of the application, which will let you know whether it is submitted or not submitted. Upon the successful submission of your application, you will receive a unique confirmation number as well as the date and time of submission. Applications must be submitted prior to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, January 12, 2016. Late applications will not be accepted. Now, one of the main questions we always get is, oh no, I submitted my application on December 27th. What if I realize that I need to change something in my application? Can I do that? Yes. During the initial filing window, you can make an unlimited number of changes to your application, whether you've submitted it already or not. For instance, let's say that you realize that you forgot to include a disclosable interest holder on the application after you submitted the application, but prior to the window closing on January 12th. you can go in and add that information. However, it is important to note that every time you change something in your submitted application, you must recertify the application or the changes will not be submitted to the Commission. This applicant, for instance, has added a disclosable interest holder here, but note that it will see a message banner at the top reminding it that the changes have not actually been submitted. To submit those changes, you must go back to that Certify and Submit page and click the Certify and Submit button in order for those changes to be submitted. And once you do that, that yellow box will go away. So this concludes the form portion of the presentation and most of the presentation as a whole. The last thing I will remind you is that an applicant is obligated to amend a pending application in order to provide additional or corrected information in accordance with the Commission's rules. And we've provided a list of contacts here should you need contacts.
Thanks, Erin. That concludes the presentation portion of the workshop. Before we go on break, I want to bring up the questions again. If you're here and you have questions, please turn the forms in at the very beginning of the break back at the registration table. We'll go over the questions during the break and answer them afterwards. Again, if you're watching online, please email auction1001@fcc.gov. Include your question as well as your name and your organization. And with that, we will take a break until 11:30 when we will begin our question and answer session. Thank you. Everyone ready? Okay, we're going to answer your questions. If we don't get to any questions today, we will continue to try to get to them. You may send questions again to auction1001@fcc.gov. And I will turn it over now to Howard Simons, the Vice Chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force.
Thanks, Craig, and again, thanks everybody for rejoining us and for being here this morning. And for your questions. We'll go through them now. We've got the presentation team here to answer the detailed questions that you provided to us. There are a number of questions. If you don't hear your question, don't worry. Some of the questions were quite detailed, and if we don't answer it here, we'll be reaching out to you to answer the question individually. So let me start here with some of the higher level questions, and then we can go on to the specific topics. First question is, what's the general timeline? How long do you expect the auction to last? The answer there is we have laid out the timeline for the auction in the application procedures public notice that was released by the task force in October. Today, of course, as you know, we begin with the opening of the application window in the reverse auction. We will proceed on through January and the early part of the spring with the forward auction window, the initial bid commitment on March 29th, and then about 3 to 4 weeks after that, the announcement of the clearing target, after which we'll begin the reverse auction clock bidding. That will go on for probably several weeks. We'll then turn to the forward auction clock bidding. That we don't have a specific deadline or timeline in mind there, but in all likelihood that will go on for a couple of months, and we will look to, assuming we finish in the first stage, look to finish the auction probably sometime in the third quarter of 2016, again projecting forward from now Obviously, the actual timeline will depend on the bidding activity and the number of stages that we have to undertake. Another question, broad question that we have is how many applications do we expect? Well, we're optimists and hopeful here, so we expect robust participation. Certainly over the last year on our road show and in meetings here at the Commission, we've seen a lot of interest by broadcasters and by potential participants in the forward auction, and we're anticipating, we're hopeful that we'll see a lot of activity, a lot of interest in the auction, but sitting here today, we don't have a predetermined number in mind, of course, not surprisingly. We received a number of questions about the ownership section of the form, and so let me start there and take a bit of a deeper dive. Doran can answer some of the specific questions, but I'd point out, as Doran did in her presentation, that there are some portions of the ownership section are optional. Some portions of the ownership section will be pre-populated when you log in because they're connected to your FRN. And with respect to the other aspects of the application that you're going to have to fill out, we've tried to provide guidance on how to fill that out, but let me turn it over to Doran and she can turn to some of the questions, specific questions that we've been getting.
Thanks, Howard. All right, so starting with, is it correct that an officer or director with less than 10% ownership does not need to be disclosed? You do not need to report officers and directors with less than a 10% interest in a applicant unless that officer or director has an otherwise reportable interest under the rules. There's a question about how options will be treated. Again, options are reported only where they confer on the holder a present ownership interest that meets the threshold, for instance, the 10% threshold outlined in the rules. There was a question about the multiplier. Anyone with that 10% present ownership interest, either direct or indirect, must be disclosed in the DIH section. For indirect interest holders, you should use the multiplier that's outlined in the rules and in the slide. And slightly still on the ownership section, but not on the actual information, there was a question about character. Do character questions, which are raised often in conjunction with the traditional broadcast forms, do they need to be disclosed? And if there's a character question, can the licensee participate? And the answer is yes, the licensee can participate, and no, there's no need to raise the character issue in conjunction with the Form 177. And last, do you need to submit FRN information for DIHs owning more than 10%? No. In the DIH section, you do not need to input an FRN, even though there is an FRN field. That information is optional.
Thanks, Doran. If people have additional questions as we go forward, please write them down, and one of our team will collect them, and we can try to address them before the end of the session. Mary Margaret, do you want to turn to some of the questions we've gotten on channel sharing?
Sure. We did receive a question on whether both parties to a CSA can enter the auction as sharees, and the answer to that is yes. If they've if they've entered into their agreement such that either of them could operate as a sharee, depending on how the auction actually runs, then they both may participate as sharees. We got a question about whether an applicant that submits a bid to relinquish and selects the having the present intent to channel share after the auction. If it goes through the auction, it does turn out to win. What happens if they do not actually find a channel sharing partner after the auction? And the answer is then they still must relinquish their license. They would go off the air. We got a question about the quiet period. and when if it doesn't start when you file the application, as opposed to the January 12th deadline, and the quiet period will only start as of 6 p.m. on January 12th. And this is because you can change your application. Nothing actually becomes submitted for the FCC's purposes until we reach that deadline.
Right, so just by way of clarification, the quiet period starts for all applicants on January 12th, regardless of when you file your application during the window.
And finally, just to clarify, we got a question about whether a potential host station has to upload its executed CSA as part of its application, and I want to clarify that that is not the case. If the host is only acting as the host, as opposed to the sort of the scenario that we just discussed, they do not have to upload their agreement as a part of their application.
Thanks, Mary Margaret. Aaron, do you want to address the relinquishment and other mechanic questions?
Sure. I'll go ahead and start with some of the basic questions on just sort of the form itself. Actually got a pretty good question here is, what if you are not planning to participate in the auction? How should you approach the FCC Form 177? The answer is, if you do not plan to participate in the auction, you do not need to fill out a form. However, if you do make the decision to not fill out the form, then you will not be able to participate. And that is a final decision, no late applications. Also, someone wanted to know if it was possible to obtain a blank Form 177. The form is electronic, so in order to see it, you do need to log into the form. So there are screenshots of the form that were submitted for the purposes of obtaining PRA approval on the OMB website that you could also try to find if you just wanted to look at them. Or again, the screenshots in this presentation are fairly thorough and also in the tutorial. Another question was, can you print or preview the form in its entirety prior to certifying and submitting? And the answer to that is yes. There is a print button in the upper right-hand corner of the form that will allow you to print out the application. However, the caveat to that is the channel sharing information that's specific to each station you select on the form is contained within the station selection screens. So to print channel sharing information, you will need to go into that part of the form and print from those screens. Everything else will print from the print button. Also, a question about the mechanics for updating an application that was filed prior to the January 12th deadline but that had already been submitted. You simply log back into the application the same way that you log in the first time, and you'll be able to change the form as necessary. And another question is, can you save your application online while you're filling it out and before you submit? Absolutely. Every time you click that save button, it saves pretty much everything you do back and forth in that form will save. There are a few places where it may not, especially if you X out of the browser without clicking the save button, but otherwise it will save. On a different point, we got a couple questions on relinquishment options, and people sort of wanted to know, choosing or not choosing them. The short answer is, if you select the relinquishment options on the form, you can bid on them in the auction. If you do not select them, then you cannot bid on them in the auction, and what your bidding strategy is up to you. Additionally, someone asked, if a station elects to go off the air as a sharee, can the station still elect all three of its options on the FCC Form 177? And the answer is yes. You would still have access to all three of those options. And for instance, this would be useful if that sharee was bidding to go off air and the price dropped below a certain point for the off air option, and it decided at that time, it was now going to bid to move to one of the other options because it was no longer going to be in that agreement. That is something that you can do. And finally, there were a couple questions related to selecting off-air and having pending proceedings. One question was, if you select off-air, you have to answer whether or not the applicant will continue to control another broadcast station. Does that refer to the applicant, or does it include stations owned by the corporate parent? The answer is, it is the applicant, the actual licensee in the application, that must continue to hold a broadcast station, to answer yes to that. On a similar note, there was a question about what is a broadcast station. This person wanted to know if the licensee will have an FM broadcast station but no television stations, would the licensee select yes or no? It could select yes, it will hold one because an FM broadcast station is a broadcast station. Thank you.
Related to that, we had a question related to an applicant that owns only a single station and intends to go off air with a channel sharing agreement. Does that applicant check the box that says that the applicant will control the station after the auction? And the answer is yes, because after the auction, that applicant is either going to be a licensee on a channel sharing context or is not going to have a winning bid, and therefore will remain a licensee on its as a full 6 megahertz licensee. So either way, even if you're a channel sharee in that kind, this is a pre-auction application that's filed with the application. That applicant would check yes to the box that says you'll be a licensee after the auction. Margie, do we have one on or a couple on prohibited communications?
We have a couple of questions about about the prohibited communications rule, and specifically where a company owns 2 or more licensees, can they use the same contact person? Can they use the same authorized bidder? And I think the answer to that is there's no specific prohibition on it, but only you know what kind of information that contact person will get. And with respect to different licensees, those different licensees could have other agreements, for instance, channel sharing agreements with different parties. So I think you have to be thinking about the specifics of your circumstances. I can't tell you that there is an absolute guarantee that there will not be a violation of the prohibited communications rule in that circumstance, but on the face of it, it's not prohibited, and you need to think about your own circumstances. And I would look carefully at the prohibited communications PN that was released on October 6th. I think that tries to explain how a lot of these things will work. And feel free to call us if you still have questions.
Team, do we get any further questions from anybody? No? If not, I guess we're done. Thank you all for coming. The materials do have the contact information from everybody who made a presentation this morning. We encourage you, as you work through the form, if you have questions, to reach out to us either by email or by calling. We are ready and available to answer your questions and to facilitate the application process. March 29th is the opening of the auction. I know we've got a number of petitions for reconsideration and appeals pending, but that turns out to be the norm in these auctions, and we are planning on moving ahead on March 29th with the auction as scheduled. Thank you all for coming and for your interest, and I'm sure we will be in touch.